Thank you so much, Anthony. I should say that doctor on today's program is premature, but welcome. um, this presentation is on a developing paper tangential to my doctoral research. This paper will appear in a special issue of the International Journal of Law and Context in early 2021. My doctoral project has been a mixed methods empirical study in Japan and Australia, which concerns a soft regulatory mechanism at the base of John Braithwaite's regulatory enforcement pyramid. This mechanism I studied is civil oversight, and the institution was prisons. My focus is on institutional regulation, but I picked up insights into criminal justice systems along the way. My study included about 1,400 Japanese prisoners, and I noticed some striking differences in my data in attitudes between older and younger prisoners. I knew that elderly cohorts had been flooding into Japanese prisons for some time, and what I saw in my data happened to shed light on this phenomenon. So this presentation really grows out of some serendipity. This led to the reverse regulation insights, which are in my abstract for today, and it's this presentation in this context has given me an opportunity for a fresh look at how an open door to one type of institution can be directly related to restricted access to other types of institutions. And it would have been a good idea to change slides, and that's how I change slides. There we go. That's the image you should have been looking at. Moving along to the third slide. Those aged 65 plus now make up nearly 30% of the population in Japan. This is seen as rising up to maybe 40% in 2065. Nearly 60% of those people live alone or with a spouse. After the war, 50% of Japanese households were multi-generational and provided residential aged care in that family setting. Now that's only 10% of Japanese households. The aged care sector or industry has not stepped up. There's a pervasive lack of access to residential aged care institutions and an acute labour shortage in the sector for at least the last 20 years, which is forecast to reach 377,000 workers shortfall in 2025. The national pension is intractably inadequate, especially for divorced or never married women who receive a fraction of the pension available to other women. Welfare payments are meagre, minimalistic, and very few people qualify for welfare in Japan. So you see this slide has an implied correlation between poverty and crime rates, which is the subject of my talk. Let me just say that there's a criminological axiom that holds true between jurisdictions and across time. Crime control is frequently portrayed in the press or by politicians as a matter of lax or coercive enforcement, but actually the only factors that reliably correlate closely with crime rates are economic factors. So Japan's tale is a cautionary tale. Prisons are usually deployed to regulate the populace, but in tale, the populace regulated the prison. A ballooning population of marginalised, isolated, impoverished elderly slid into habitual deviance. This trend was met with a rigid response from an authoritarian East Asian state with anachronistic, siloed criminal justice and welfare structures. So for over 25 years, the Japanese state was remarkably willing to incarcerate grandma and grandpa, even when they had been convicted of trivial offences. They were positioned as threats to the social order. This punitive response amplified their vulnerability and added further layers of incapacity and stigma. But many elderly prisoners were complicit in their own incarceration, using prisons as a proxy for access to aged care institutions, which they were denied. As this self-incarceration trend increased, prisons began to suffer increasingly intolerable resourcing pressure. The state was eventually forced to respond with a very adept combination of law and policy, which has turned back the tide or at least stemmed the tide. So looking at the shape of the elderly crime problem, over the last 20 years, the number of elderly offenders has increased by about twice the rate of increase in the elderly population as a whole. By 2011, crime by those aged 65 plus exceeded crime by those in their 20s in Japan. The prison population, and limiting here to considering those over 65, increased by a factor of 4.2 over 2 decades, for women by a factor of 9.1. Even a single prison sentence for an elderly person leads to a chronic inability to reintegrate. Family embrace is gone. Japanese families will disown any member who is incarcerated, even an elderly, frail member. Aged care homes will not take a person with a criminal record or an ex-offender. Employers will not employ them, and welfare payments have been routinely denied as a matter of discretion, even though these people were on paper entitled. This produced built-in cycles of homelessness and reoffending. And given these circumstances, it's been rational for the vulnerable elderly to escape to rather than from prison. So considering the impact on prisons, Japanese prisons feed on a constant supply of healthy, defiant young male offenders. All prisons do to some extent, but particularly in Japan. They run the prison, they earn money for the prison by working in prison factories, which is not a matter of choice. Overcrowding and greying caused acute resourcing issues. Prisons are exquisitely ill-equipped to serve as proxy aged care homes. They became highly stressful workplaces where it was impossible for staff to take leave. In the 1990s, a prison officer actually died of overwork in Japan. Corrections officers are prohibited from unionising, so have no one to appeal to or no way to take collective action. The budget blowout for prisons was immense because elderly people cost around 5 times as much to incarcerate per year as young, healthy people. So this produced a groundbreaking partnership, an unprecedented collaboration between the Ministry of Justice and the Ministry of Health, Labour and Welfare, which was previously inconceivable in Japan. What was built is a functional bridge, including data and personnel sharing between two of Japan's most heavily siloed ministries. Japanese ministries compete, they do not cooperate. This has contributed to 50% decarceration in 16 years. One prison not far from where I am now is being turned into a hotel. Just having a quick look at some of the specific measures, 2 core themes of the new approach were to change nothing about the prison experience itself, but to change a great deal about what happens in the chain, the criminal justice chain, if you like, just before and just after prison. So entry support measures were introduced, which involved prosecutors actively working with welfare agencies and in some cases actually receiving credentials as social workers in order to give them the mindset that wherever possible they needed to divert vulnerable offenders away from custodial sentences. Exit supports have worked proactively through prisons from before release, bringing a tailored network, individualised tailored network for each offender of public and private resources and skills to bear in order to reintegrate and resettle them. Turning to the role my research data played in this paper that's coming out early next year. In the top box on this slide, you'll see my doctoral research question, which is not connected to this paper as such. In the multicoloured rectangle on the left, you'll see the parts of my empirical project, which was spread over 4 years. Focusing on the black arrow, you'll see I gathered survey data from around 1,500 prisoners in Japan and Australia in 2016 and 2017. So in Japan, a quarter, 349, were aged over 55. Over 55 is a legitimate definition of elderly in the prisons context. Some researchers use over 45. This is because prisoners tend to be in far worse physical and mental health than the general population due to entrenched lifelong disadvantage, including poverty, substance abuse, and chronic mental and physical health issues. So the serendipitous moment was when I sliced my data by age and saw in two cohorts, over 55s and up to 55, seven statistically significant differences. Several are quite striking and all have a certain coherence. So the theory that I'm anchoring my data insights to here in this paper that's coming out next year is actually from social psychologist Valerie Braithwaite at ANU, who proposed the concept of motivational postures to describe the attitudes, beliefs, and behaviours of people in a regulated environment. She identified 5 such postures on a spectrum from the greatest to the least level of deference. High deference and low defiance are evident when a person's vision of themselves is as being inherently moral. This person is law-abiding and they have nothing to fear from authority. The attitudes seen in my data concerning elderly prisoners in Japan map to high deference, low defiance postures. This is consistent with other information we have about them, which is that many have nowhere else to go. Whether consciously or subconsciously, it suggests that these are people who have turned to prison to meet their needs for shelter, sustenance, security, and social contact. And today's presentation gave me the opportunity to see what I could learn from those insights in Japan and apply to Australia. And I thought of Indigenous inclusion in criminal justice institutions in Australia. This is our overrepresented group, our hyper-incarcerated group in Australia. 3% of our population, but 28% of the adult prison population, and half of all juvenile detainees. 78% of Indigenous prisoners have been in prison before. You'll see at the bottom of this slide that Indigenous Australians are now incarcerated at higher rates than African Americans. When Justice Matthew Myers was gathering submissions for his 2017 ALRC inquiry into Indigenous overrepresentation in prisons, he came to ANU and I asked him about the normalisation of prison time among Indigenous people. He said that exclusion from society has become inclusion in prison. Over the last 15 years in particular, in functional terms, we have moved entire Indigenous communities into prisons. And we've been cheerfully building more prisons to make this possible. It is not unusual, for example, in the New South Wales Northern Rivers area for an Indigenous child to aspire to when they are old enough to offend so that they can spend more time with their family members who are all in prison. And then I thought of institutional exclusion suffered by this cohort in Australia, and given to whom I am speaking, I immediately thought of financial exclusion. This received considerable attention in the Hayne Report. In 2019, a study co-authored that emerged from UNSW and the NAB and a Indigenous NGO established that 49% of Indigenous participants in the study were experiencing high or severe financial stress chronically. This is a level 5 times what we see in the Australian population as a whole. Only 10% felt they were financially secure. This is 1/3 of the rate we see in the overall population. So how are these things related? Much of the trivial offending for which Indigenous people are imprisoned in Australia could be resolved with access to financial resources, but Indigenous people have a pervasive lack of access. The Black Lives Matter movement in the US has highlighted the perspective that policies enabling institutional exclusion from the ability to accumulate wealth will lead to inclusion in criminal justice institutions. In other words, it's not about income support. It's about wealth accretion and being locked out of mechanisms by which this happens for most Australians. In America, Greer and Bright have already made this connection, and in fact there's a growing field of financial social work with post-release prisoners understanding that financial access, financial skills, financial know-how are essential to prevent recidivism. So the question I've been asking myself, and which I would be glad to hear your views on, is whether it's time for justice to meet financial services in Australia. What we are seeing is that the Meyer report in 2017 on hyperincarceration for Indigenous people doesn't mention financial services exclusion. The Hayne report and the UNSW NAB report I just mentioned, both in 2019, on financial system exclusion, don't mention hyperincarceration for Indigenous people. Both Meyer and Hayne led to regulatory change, but they were largely limited to within their own sectors, in other words, siloed, not integrated. In Japan, what worked was coordinated state-led regulatory change of both institutions at the same time. In Japan, obviously, aged care or welfare institutions and prisons. In Australia, the pairing is different, so prisons and financial institutions. And this is my last slide. In Australia, civil society actors and private sector actors, including all four major banks, have moved on this since the Hayne report. But something to note in Japan was the drivers for change were clearly not related to fundamental change in criminal justice ethos. There was no adoption of human rights, no change in public discourse on humanitarian concerns or human rights concerns for elderly prisoners. Instead, the change was purely economic rationalist. It was cost and burden shifting after needy citizens swamped an institution ill-prepared to meet their needs. Why is this important? It has something to tell us about how industrialized jurisdictions can use rational resource allocation frameworks that don't involve controversial human rights concepts, unlikely to be sympathetically received by the electorate, and still achieve wholesale decarceration of a vulnerable group. Kirsty Murr at the UNSW Business School Centre for Social Impact reported in 2016 that Indigenous financial inclusion could generate nearly $3 billion in GDP. That is the amount we spend annually on locking Indigenous people up. So actually we're talking about a $6 billion difference. My question to myself, and this task is best left to civil society and the private sector, or whether state intervention is justified. Thank you.